glad to see you. Here we are in another virtual environment. Let me just say that we miss you, but we're glad to see you this way. So thank you for joining us today and spending some time with us focusing on teaching. This year's conference theme is focusing on quality teaching and teaching evaluation as we strive to continue creating a culture of excellence in teaching at Texas Tech University. The Teaching, Learning, and Professional Development Center and the Texas Tech Teaching Academy have partnered together to evaluate how we might approach teaching evaluations from a three-pronged focus: information from others, information from self, and information from our students. A little bit of background might help us frame today's conference. Representatives from Texas Tech were accepted to an invitation-only workshop last fall, convened by the Network of STEM Education Centers, the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities, and the TVAL project. It's an NSF-funded project. One of the advisory campuses in that workshop was the University of Southern California. Dr. Ginger Clark, the Associate Vice Provost for Academic and Faculty Affairs, is leading USC's Teaching Excellence Initiative, and she'll be sharing about their journey today as our keynote speaker. Dr. Emily Miller from the Association of American Universities will get us started this morning by offering some introductory comments and framing our session today. We're also privileged to have two sessions, one from the recipient of the Departmental Excellence in Teaching Award and one from a subcommittee of the Teaching Academy. Okay, so the word of the day is flexibility, right? We've all done these online conferences. The wind is howling through my windows. I hope you can't hear it. It smells like dirt here in West Texas, right? But we're glad to be together and we'll all be flexible with each other. So before we get started with our conference today, I want to note that we have an interpreter. I hope that you can see Michelle, her colleague Suzanne. They'll be trading off. We also have captions. They aren't perfect, but they're one way that we can provide some accessibility. So we hope that you notice these two things. I also want to say, in appreciation to my colleagues at the Teaching, Learning, and Professional Development Center and the Teaching Academy, thank you. Thank you for your work in pulling together this virtual event. So before we get started with Dr. Miller, we'd like to set aside just a moment to recognize one of our beloved faculty members. So I'm going to share my screen here. And I'd like to take a moment on behalf of the Texas Tech Teaching, Learning, and Professional Development Center and the Teaching Academy to dedicate the 17th annual ATLC conference to the late Dr. Charlie Klein, Associate Professor in Landscape Architecture. I'm going to read these remarks, see if I can get through it. As I take a moment to read a few notes about Charlie, I invite you to share your thoughts in the chat and to take a look at our conference dedication page, or maybe to look at the address that's in the chat now and look at those wonderful pictures of Dr. Klein. Dr. Klein passed away on Christmas Day with COVID complications. We honor Charlie's memory today by acknowledging his passion and dedication to teaching and his lasting legacy on his students, colleagues, and community. Charlie was an innovative teacher, nationally recognized in study abroad programs, an advocate for service learning pedagogy, and an active and respected professional landscape architect. Charlie had a passion for experiential learning, leading him to be an early adopter and supporter of Texas Tech service learning. He participated and gave his time to support and encourage other faculty to implement service learning in their teaching. In 2008, Charlie was a service learning faculty fellow here at the TLPDC. He later served as a mentor in that program. One of his most notable teaching projects spanned the last decade, leading a community-focused ecotourism project in the Yucatan Peninsula in Merida, Mexico. Charlie was known for his willingness and ability to collaborate with colleagues. One recent example was an interdisciplinary collaboration with Melinda Caldwell from Human Development and Family Studies and Christy Gaines from the Department of Design. Their grant-funded project, known as OLE, focused on outdoor learning environments to combat childhood obesity through healthy and active lifestyles. Charlie's service to our Texas Tech community was tremendous, and over his tenure, he was appointed and received many honors and awards that show his continual dedication and passion for students. Charlie will be deeply missed. He will remain an inspiration with his warm, gentle spirit and never-ending focus on our students and their learning. So we honor Charlie today. And let me get back to this. Again, we invite you to share your comments in the chat if you like, and share a memory about Charlie and how he may have influenced you. We will miss him. Let us turn now to the focus of the day, and that is some great sessions ahead for you. Dr. Emily Miller is the Associate Vice President for Policy at AAU, the Association of American Universities. Her primary responsibility focuses on collaborating with campuses on institutional policy efforts related to undergraduate and graduate education. She directs the AAU Undergraduate STEM and Education Initiative, the PhD Education Initiative, and several other grant-funded activities. Dr. Ginger Clark is an Associate Vice Provost for Academic and Faculty Affairs and leads USC's Teaching Excellence Initiative. USC's initiative focuses on defining, developing, rigorously evaluating, and meaningfully rewarding teaching excellence, using the same framework that promotes excellence in research. Ginger also serves as the director of the USC Center for Excellence in Teaching. Ginger maintains her position as a professor of clinical education in marriage and family therapy. We are thankful for the silver lining of the pandemic that allows us to gather virtually with such accomplished presenters. Would you please join me in clapping and virtually welcoming Dr. Miller and Dr. Clark? And Dr. Miller, I will pass to you now.
Thank you, Suzanne, for such a wonderful introduction and what a thoughtful way to begin your program in honor of your colleague. I am going to share my screen now and of that. Is it visible to the audience? That's always a good start. So hello, I'm Emily Miller, and it is a great pleasure to join you today to place my remarks on more effective ways to evaluate teaching in the faculty reward structures in context. I want to acknowledge that in 2011, AAU launched the Undergraduate STEM Education Initiative, aimed at dismantling inequitable structures, content, and practices within introductory undergraduate STEM courses through cultural change at the departmental level. AAU, in partnership with our member campuses and other national organizations, have pushed to make inclusive, evidence-based teaching and learning practices and student-centered educational environments the norm. I know that you can't see these slides, but I'll be sharing the slides, and each of these 4 slides will be more visible to you. But in AAU's Undergraduate STEM Education Initiative, we took a systems perspective and identified a set of key institutional elements that need to be addressed in order to bring about sustainable change. And to help campuses measure progress, AAU developed a parallel resource in support of the framework. AAU worked intentionally with a pilot cohort of 8 campuses and engaged a broader network of AAU member campuses to advance the goals of the initiative, to be as excellent in teaching as we are in research. One outcome of this work is the identification of cross-cutting strategies that have been essential to fostering a culture of effective and inclusive teaching in introductory foundational STEM courses. These levers for change were originally highlighted in our 5-year status report and renewed and reaffirmed in new ways this past spring in the context of the global pandemic and our national discourse on racial inequity in our country. Rethinking assessments of teaching and learning has always been a goal of the initiative and came forth in both of these reports. In the spring, meeting participants spent much time discussing how assessments of faculty teaching and student learning proved to be extremely challenging in the emergency switch to remote instruction. They acknowledged how the extraordinary circumstances of the spring term prohibited campuses from implementing teaching evaluation tools in the ways that they were designed. As a result, some campuses did not administer student course evaluations in any form. Others did choose to administer them on a voluntary basis or required basis, did so only to inform practice rather than assess teaching performance. AAU member campuses recognized how this situation has magnified questions and conversations around the use or absence of student ratings in hiring, contract renewal, tenure, promotion, and merit decisions. As a result, it has created an opportunity for campuses to rethink how they assess teaching and their faculty evaluation process. Meeting participants also pointed out, in a similar manner, challenges presented by remote teaching have created an opportunity for faculty members to reconsider how they assess student learning. AAU has always worked to try to connect our efforts in the initiative into the national dialogue and discourse. So we have worked with fellow national partners to transform the evaluation of teaching together. It was referenced in the opening about the work that the Association of Public Land-Grant Universities has engaged in, and it was wonderful to hear. And actually, I was a participant and joined in that summer meeting. It was wonderful to see you all there. And there are other national stakeholders, the Accelerating Systemic Change in STEM Higher Education Network, an NSF grant-funded project called TVAL, under the Bayview Alliance, and the work of the National Academies. Before I go further with my remarks, I wanted to take a moment to practice a bit of evidence-based, presentation as much as possible. And if you could take a moment to make a quick list of your teaching-related activities in a typical week before the term begins or during it. If you could just pull out a piece of paper or think in your head, what are your typical teaching-related activities that you engage in during the course of a week? Now, looking at that list or thinking about what you thought of, how much of that work is visible? How much of it is invisible? And a question has become for this national community, how will we make the full range of teaching activities, both the visible and the invisible, and the intellectual work that goes into them, part of the evaluation process? I want to note that this is not a new issue. Almost 3 decades of work extending from Ernest Boyer's 1990s report, Scholarship Reconsidered, on more effective ways to document teaching have existed. However, the ease with which student evaluation surveys are administered and used in the promotion and tenure process has resulted in a long-standing practice that presents barriers to innovation and scholarly teaching. But there is renewed energy and motivation. There are growing national discussions about the critical importance of providing high-quality, evidence-based, inclusive undergraduate educational experiences across the modes of locations and delivery modalities. Challenges of the current context have magnified conversations about the evaluation of teaching. Teaching effectiveness is overwhelmingly assessed using the student evaluation surveys completed at the end of each course, despite evidence that these evaluations rarely measure teaching effectiveness, contain known biases, promote the status quo, and in some cases reward poor teaching. There's also increasing evidence that unintended bias of students influence on course evaluations. The rapid transition in teaching and learning in higher education, along with concerns about equity in students' experiences and demands on faculty, create an opportunity to rethink the process for evaluating faculty work, including teaching, and re-envisioning approaches to high-quality teaching and learning. Our collaboration across multiple organizations has really built on this renewed energy and motivation. And we have some shared vision on how we would think of defining effective teaching. How do we showcase and highlight effective frameworks and processes being advanced on many campuses? And how do we disseminate that widely? This community with these goals came together in 2019, and it resulted in a proceedings that was published. And together we worked to further engage the community of stakeholders. And building from this work, we were pleased to host just this January a national dialogue on transforming STEM teaching evaluation in higher education. Building from the earlier report, the National Academies, along with partner organizations, hosted a 3-part series of virtual events to further the national conversation about the reform to teaching evaluation. The goals were to contextualize the critical importance of effective and inclusive teaching today, understand the broad array of models and approaches, and examine strategies on how to address cross-cutting challenges to the reform of the evaluation of teaching process. There were many institutional examples were featured part of this national dialogue. During the second week, there was a poster symposium, and I encourage you to go look at the posters and all the different modes and modalities for which teaching evaluation is being reimagined. I'd also say that there are a variety of forthcoming events for you and your colleagues to engage in. We welcome you and we encourage you to participate in these ongoing conversations. And in conclusion, I just wanted to put 2 questions up for you to reflect on and to think about, and I can happily, based on our time, think about time for questions. But what key factors need to be central to reimagining the faculty reward structure? And what do you believe would be a strong starting point on your campus to transform teaching evaluation? I've put at the end of the slide deck a number of AAU reports, peer-reviewed publications, as well as teaching evaluation specific resources, both domestically and internationally, that are really showing about new models and new ways to think about evaluating teaching. I'm going to stop sharing my slides here. And I want to honor where we are in time within the program. And so I know Ginger Clark will be giving a strong institutional example coming from USC. She's a friend and a colleague, and I know you'll learn quite a bit from her experience and work at USC in this space. But Suzanne, I'll just pause there and say if there's time for some discussion or questions, I'll happily take them.
Please, that would be great. We have plenty of time.
Great. I always find it fun to just engage with the audience. So if people want to put questions in the chat, or if they can raise their hand, I'll happily just call on individuals who raise their hand.
Emily, you have a couple of comments in the chat from Courtney Myers and Laura Fisher that might be interesting.
Yes. So how would we document the idea of the invisible work? So the student evaluation, I hear terminology shifting in that it is not a student evaluation, it's a student experience. So most campuses are reimagining them, are trying to document the student voice to the student experience, what is a survey that could speak to the student experience. But that means that there's many other forms of evidence that need to be pulled together in the process. And University of Kansas has a really strong rubric on how different forms of evidence and can be brought forward in the process. And as a result, that's where the documentation of the invisible work can start to emerge and be demonstrated. Things around learning outcomes and how you are intentionally linking assessments and designing assessments back to the learning objectives of your course. How are you thinking about the design and the pedagogy of each individual class? Those are things that are more the invisible work, but that can be documented, and pieces of evidence can be brought forward in a more robust, framework or rubric of information and evidence. So we have about the invisible work here. I would say too, in this more holistic range of work, the pieces of evidence start to look a bit different. And I think that there's been a lot of ways where amongst this reflection, and we know how important reflection can be for learning, how reflection and faculty members' reflection is coming into the conversation. One of the AAU member campuses, dare I say UT Austin, so another Texas institution, in their College of Natural Sciences has made the shift to on observations of teaching being different. Instead of a faculty member going to observe someone teaching and writing an observation of their teaching, they write a reflection on their own teaching after the observation. So it has removed this fear of being like watched or but it has proved to be very valuable because the observer is actually reflecting on their own teaching practices, having watched some of their colleagues teach, and it has opened up far more classrooms for observation and places of learning. What kind of, the two questions that I asked was, one is really the two questions that I posed, and I can try to put them here in the chat for you, are what key factors need to be central to reimagining the faculty reward structure? Like really, when you think about reimagining the faculty reward structure, what needs to be considered? And the reason why I pose that question is there's the what is used in the evaluation, and then there is the process. And so how does the process become more equitable? How does the process become more transparent? Who are on the committees? And so I think that there's two pieces of what is the evidence that a faculty member can put forth, and also what is the process by which they're going to go through. And the second question was, where do you think there's a strong starting point on your campus? And I raised that is some campuses have begun with their faculty senates, and it's been a place of the conversation at the faculty senate. Some it has been more departmental innovations and focuses. Some have happened more at the college level. So there's a variety of starting places for campuses for this work, and I'd encourage you to think about where would be the most effective starting place on your campus for this work. Happy to share the link to the poster session with the National Academies is up. I believe there were probably about 60 or 70 posters from institutions across the country, and they ranged from community colleges to PUIs to liberal arts to research institutions. I think about 34 AAU institutions were a part of those poster sessions, really highlighting some different innovations going on their campuses. So I'll be sure to share those with you. A question from Jody on any efforts that may exist about capturing student learning after time? So example, what a student remembers after 6 months. Yes, so some of campuses that are becoming really harnessing data to help inform teaching and learning are using that to understand students' pathways through the institution, understanding about student performance. And there are some really robust data visualizations that are showing how students are performing in subsequent courses. And so that information can be used in a variety of ways. But a faculty member who has maybe redesigned an introductory course or like a first course in a series, seeing how students are performing in subsequent courses or courses that are requiring that one as a prerequisite, how the students are performing in those subsequent courses is something that some faculty members have looked at. And as a result, that's evidence that they're putting forth because it's able to really document how the students didn't just learn in that particular course, but how that deep knowledge carried forward with the student and has informed their participation in subsequent courses. So I would say that evidence does exist on campuses, and I think how it's being used varies greatly, but it is an opportunity for a faculty member to connect student learning into the evaluation process. And I think that's something we do not want to lose sight of, is that the evaluation of teaching should be trying to document learning by the students. A current kind of an initiative in this space, Michigan State University in their chemistry department is really working hard to think about some new evaluation of teaching connected to learning outcomes. And that's with some longstanding work that they've done on redesigning the introductory foundational general chemistry, and they've also moved on to organic chemistry. Melanie Cooper has really led that work, but their transformations of the teaching of the courses and student learning is now their next kind of horizon of work within the department is how to reward faculty and value that work that faculty are doing in those spaces. So that'd be an exemplar to look at as it connects to the measuring of student learning.
Emily, I think that I'll go ahead and jump in now, and
yes,
thank you for being so flexible in answering questions. I have good news, friends. Emily is going to be here with us and participate through several of with Dr. Clark's presentation, and then hopefully on a little bit this afternoon. I hope that we continue to see this robust discussion in the chat. I know that she would be glad to join in there, and that we have a lot of collective wisdom in this room. So let's keep going with this chat. So we'll transition now, and let's take just a moment and show appreciation for Dr. Miller, and my goodness, the depth of knowledge. Thank you. Thank you for getting us started. We'll turn now. Thanks. We'll turn now to Dr. Clark. Ginger, we've already had a moment to introduce you. So we're just going to turn the program straight to you, and thank you for being here with us.
Thank you all very much. I apologize for my challenges here this morning, but I am ready to go. Is it okay if I share my screen? Great. All right, and can you all see that? Okay. Okay, good. So let's see here. So I want to talk to you today about USC's Teaching Excellence Initiative, and I want to share with you what we've done so far, what we've learned, and where we are in the process now. All right. So our goal was really to build the same infrastructure for teaching that we have for research. And you can see in this image, I'm very proud of this image. I created it myself. My graphic design skills are outstanding. So we're trying to build the same infrastructure for teaching as we are for research. So we already had a pretty well-established pathway for our researchers to get to the top of the mountain, but we wanted to build out the same pathways to promote teaching excellence. And to build those pathways for teaching excellence, just as with research, we had to first agree on a criteria for teaching excellence, and that led to our definition of excellence in teaching. And then we wanted to invest in faculty development to help them reach those criteria that are in our definition of excellence in teaching. And we also wanted to create the same kind of rigorous peer review process for teaching that we have for research. And then finally, in order for all of this to be taken seriously at the university, the faculty would really need to see our incentive structures change, because we're a research university. Our incentives are all aligned with excellence in research, and we really needed to do better in terms of showing teaching within our incentive structure criteria. So we needed to create structures that would reward teaching in meaningful and robust ways. And then finally, we had to ensure that each school, we're very decentralized at USC, and so each school is its own kingdom or queendom. And so we had to ensure that each school then had very similar infrastructure within the school to meaningfully support teaching. So where did the initiative originate? I get asked this question a lot, and I think it reflects the tension within the shared governance model of higher education. Folks don't like top-down mandates, and bottom-up initiatives without support from leadership often don't go anywhere. So our initiative was born out of our academic senate, and then it was taken up by the provost. And there were 3 reports that came from faculty task forces and committees, one from the Senate, and then one was convened by the provost, and then there was a joint provost-Senate committee that created a report, all 3 of which had recommendations about what we needed to do about teaching at USC. But even with this shared sort of origin story between, the administration and the faculty, we still encountered pushback with the initiative, mostly from folks who hadn't been involved in the governance process that created that sort of built the foundation for the initiative, And those folks felt blindsided by the change. And I'll talk more about our lessons learned from that in a little bit. So what was the process for developing the initiative? So to develop it, we drafted the model and the initiative from the report recommendations that I just mentioned. And we used the Faculty Advisory Board for the Center for Excellence in Teaching to help, we use them as sort of the initiative advisory board, faculty advisory board, to then help refine our work on the initiative. And once we had a draft of the initiative in place, we took it on the road and we visited faculty councils and faculty meetings and tried to get into each of the schools. Now, as a side note, there were a few schools that declined the request to come and meet with the faculty and talk about the initiative and the changes. And as you might expect, those were the schools that tended to have the faculty who were most unhappy with the initiative. And I believe it was because the only information those faculty had about the initiative were from memos, which, as we know, nobody reads memos. And so, so they didn't have a chance to understand what was happening, and they didn't have a chance to add their voice to the process. So I strongly recommend finding ways to talk to as many faculty as possible. And I suggest getting their input early and have multiple modes of communication that you're using about any kind of broad changes you're making around teaching, as well as multiple pathways for them to contribute information, feedback, response to the process. So then back to the slide, after the initiative was further refined from our advisory board, we then created, and from the meetings that I had with faculty, we then created these resources that would support the initiative. And I'll talk a little bit more about those resources in a bit, but essentially we were trying to make the process as easy as possible, even though we knew it was going to be an incredibly hard process because it was such a big change. So we tried to create things like a definition of excellence in teaching at the university level, templates or resources for peer review, tools and so forth that could be used later. And I'll talk more about that. So then after we created those resources, we asked the Academic Senate and our advisory board to give us feedback. And again, we made further revisions to those resources. Okay, so as you're thinking about making change at the university, my recommendation would be communicate, communicate, communicate. And as we all know, communication is the Achilles heel of universities. It's how, good intentions, it's where they go to die, because we just aren't able to get people, first of all, aware of what we're thinking about. But secondly, we aren't able to get the feedback that we need from the people we need it from very easily. And so my recommendation would be create a website that explains what it is you're trying to do. University of Oregon did a really nice job with this. They sort of informed their campus all along the way in their process of reforming their teaching evaluation. And so I thought that was a great model. I wish I would have thought of that. But I would create a website to publicize the initiative, as well as publicize progress that you're making, attach multiple modes of communication to that website, as well as obviously using email and social media and all of the things that are available to us to both get information out, but also allow feedback and input to come in. And if you have ideas for creating good communication plans on your campus, I hope you'll share it in the chat so that you all can kind of keep track of some of the ideas that are happening as we talk today. So another piece of what we learned was, in terms of outreach to the campus, this is where I really think we missed the boat at USC. We relied on the Academic Senate for approvals and for feedback on the initiative. And I'm a former Senate president, so I believe in the Senate process. I thought that's what you're supposed to do when you're working on, university-wide initiatives. But what I didn't realize is how many people pay absolutely zero attention to what goes on in the academic senate. And so there has to be sort of multiple methods for getting the faculty voice, not just through governance structures. We also didn't involve students in our process, which I think was a big mistake. I think they would have provided really good input and also would have provided very powerful leverage for the change. It's very difficult to sort of imply or state that teaching isn't a priority at the university when you have students in the room, right? And so if I had this to do over again, I would hold multiple town hall meetings, small group meetings with faculty. I would ask our faculty councils, which are our governance structures within each of the schools. I would have asked them to lead discussions in their faculty meetings about the initiative and about our various phases of the initiative, and to give me feedback on where those discussions went and what were some of the key takeaways. And I would gather much more input from many more sort of stakeholders at every sort of stage of the plan and implementation. And then my sort of strategy for this would be to start with asking the question, why should we do this? And I'll talk more about some of those key questions in just a second. Before I talk about the questions though, I also wish that we would have found more campus partners earlier in our process. We connected with the Senate, we had our Center for Excellence in Teaching, we had the Provost's office, but it wasn't until later that we really started to think about the contribution and the leverage and the content expertise that some of our other campus partners could have provided us in this process, in terms of money, access, influence, as well as input and feedback. And they could also help us formulate some of those key questions I'm going to talk about. Things that we need to grapple with. So for instance, student affairs hears more than really anybody on campus about the student experience. They have their sort of finger on the pulse of how things are going, not just in student social lives, but in class, because students talk to them about that. And so I wish we would have brought them in sooner to help us kind of frame why this matters and why we should be doing this. And then again, if you have ideas about other key partners on your campus that you think would be important to making a change at Texas Tech, I hope you'll share that in the chat with one another so that you can kind of memorialize some of these ideas. So getting back to those questions I was talking about earlier, I think we need to start with those questions. I think we missed the mark by thinking that we could take recommendations from the Senate and from these faculty committees and implement them without actively engaging the entire faculty around these issues. There are some issues where it's appropriate to go ahead and kind of, take what the Senate says and go ahead and implement it. But a change of this magnitude, I think, really requires us to go back to the entire faculty and sort of have some of these conversations all over again, right? It's not that we have to start from scratch. We can already be making some progress even as we have those conversations. And some of those conversations will give us ideas or input that we hadn't had before through our communication with the Senate. But I think what having those conversations does is it allows us to grapple together as a university with hard questions about teaching. And we need to clarify our values around that as a community before we implement a change of this size. And we didn't ask those questions until we were sort of interacting or having conversations with people who were sort of resisting this change. And by that time, asking those questions then just seemed like a defensive strategy, right? As opposed to a process to help us kind of frame our direction. And so, I think questions like, does teaching matter? What do we owe our students? What is good teaching? I think asking the university questions like, does the university care about educating students? And what's the evidence for that? How do we know that? How would someone from the outside looking in be able to see some of, Texas Tech, for instance, some of their structures and, criteria for excellence? Would they know immediately that teaching matters? Some of the reward structures, are they aligned with teaching? And then how do we know that we're good teachers? Having those conversations around evaluation. What are the metrics that we're using, and are they rigorous? Like, do we really feel proud of how we're coming out on the metrics we're using? And are we proud of the metrics themselves? Like, do we feel like they're rigorous so that if we do well, we know that we're sort of demonstrating excellence in our work? I think having those conversations would have helped sort of get greater buy-in around the initiative at our school. So again, if you have other questions that you think should be asked at your institution, again, please do share them in the chat so that we can keep those as you're moving forward. And I just want to be sure that, let's see here. I want to be sure that I can see the chat. So I'm going to pull it out here so that I can kind of keep an eye on it. Okay. So this slide, I have all these strategies that I just talked about that I would use to do things differently if I were to do it again at USC, to improve the process, to improve the outcomes, to improve campus buy-in. But I honestly don't know if they would have made a difference in the pushback we got. I think because this is such a big change, we may have gotten pushback no matter what. And we felt like the change was aligned with our core values, so we kept going even though not everyone was happy, and some people were even outraged about the change. I think for many people, it felt like we were changing the rules on them. They were brought into the university at a time where our UCAPT manual said, your teaching should be adequate or something like that, and your research should be excellent, right? And then, mid-career or even at the tail end of their career, we're now saying, no, teaching really matters, and we want you to do all of these things to invest in it. And so I think some folks felt a little blindsided. I think that some people felt attacked. Like, are you saying I'm not a good teacher? Are we doing this because you believe that our teaching is suffering at USC? And then we also had people who were very honest with us, and I frankly kind of had respect for this. They sort of said what was really happening for them, which is teaching is not a priority for them. They felt that they were hired to do research. They felt that they were hired to come into the university to raise its stature as a research university, and this was not a priority for them, and it wasn't going to be. And so while I think most of these concerns could be, if not prevented, they could be mitigated if you use some of the strategies we talked about, I do think that you should be prepared for pushback. And, hopefully you won't make some of the same mistakes we did, and you'll create a productive path to communication early on. But the truth is, you're not going to reach everyone. And the goal here is to change the culture, right? It's not to change the minds of every individual faculty member. And so, even though we haven't reached everyone at USC, I do think we're still making good progress. So that progress would not have occurred without the explicit and action-oriented support of the Provost's office and of the Academic Senate, as well as some of our other campus partners. Those key leaders across campus were really critical to the initiative's progress and to addressing some of the concerns that came up in the previous slide. So the Senate has done a number of things to support the initiative since its launch. It's held Senate meetings to address some of the concerns that were brought up about the initiative. It's charged its Joint Provost Senate Committee on Teaching and Academic Programs. That committee this year queried all of our schools to find out where their progress was on their teaching plans, which you'll learn a little bit more about in a bit. And And in doing that, all of a sudden we had some newly revised teaching plans coming into my office because the Academic Senate Committee was starting to ask about that. And what was great about that is that it was more than just me emailing saying, hey, have you made some progress on these various elements of your teaching plan? It was actually the Academic Senate sort of throwing its weight behind the initiative and asking for progress. And that helped move things forward as well. The Provost's office wrote and spoke publicly about support for the initiative. The provost at the time and this current provost changed policy about how teaching would be evaluated. They brought in essentially, it's me, but a person dedicated to the oversight of the teaching initiative to the Provost's office. They reorganized the Center for Excellence in Teaching and invested in it. We've received 2 additional positions this year to help grow our staff because the provost sort of recognized that in order for the campus to move forward, faculty were going to need a lot of support. And so we needed to invest in that support. And then our campus partners have been amazing. They've collaborated on faculty trainings with us. They've provided technical support and content expertise, such as teaching issues related to race or inclusion, or accessibility, wellness, and so forth. And academic deans, so the deans in the schools, a number of them have created new positions in their senior leadership teams, such as vice deans for teaching, to support their own teaching initiatives. So there's been some real kind of visible change from leaders at the university that has really sort of given credibility to the seriousness of USC around the initiative. So to illustrate what a big change this was, let's take a look at what we used to do to demonstrate our value of teaching at USC. And I love this slide because it's such a stark reminder of how our behavior didn't match our stated values around teaching. So this is how we used to evaluate teaching at USC. So it was student evaluations. Item 11, overall, how would you rate this course? Item 12, overall, how would you rate this instructor? And that's it. That's how we evaluated teaching at USC. And yet all of our materials, all of our marketing materials and everything talked about the USC experience. It talked about how students would get a great education at USC. But our criteria and our process didn't demonstrate that commitment to education and to student experience. So let's compare that to what's recommended for evaluating teaching in the education literature. So a comprehensive, systematic approach to evaluating multiple components of the teaching process. And that can include, peer review, which would be instructional observation, review of course materials, review of how faculty are doing assessments, what kind of grading feedback they're providing, and so forth. So I'll show you where we are now in the change process. So I'll walk you through the implementation of our initiative using the model that we're implementing as the framework for the walkthrough. Okay. So this is the model we're working towards now. So think of this model, if you sort of turn this model sideways, it would be like those stackable rings you see in children's toys, right? So this is sort of a stacked model of teaching, and the foundational layers or levels that support teaching at the university are the university layer, the school layer, and then the faculty layer. And then there are 3 cornerstones, if you can see those kind of rising up through each of the layers, that have to be addressed at each level, right? And that's development, evaluation, and reward. And then there's a central column that feeds resources into each of those cornerstones and each level that's addressing teaching. And that represents our Center for Excellence in Teaching. That's where we come in, is to support the work that's happening at all the various levels. So let's take this sort of one thing at a time. So we started at the university level. At the university level, we developed a USC definition of excellence in teaching, and that was used as our foundation for everything we did. So the definition underlies all three cornerstones of the model. It informs the resources and the policies that we created to drive the initiative. The criteria within the definition determined our teaching development programming. So we use those criteria to think about what we needed to help faculty develop in terms of skills or knowledge. It drove our peer review evaluation tools that we developed, the training that we provided for those tools. Those criteria were front and center in those peer evaluation tools. And it also drove the revision of our student learning experience evaluation tool that I'll talk about in a second. And then finally, it drove our revised reward structure. Okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the definition. So the definition, as I mentioned, framed everything we did. This is the definition here. I have the website here. I'm going to send these slides to you also that you can have them, but you can go look up the definition on our website. But it framed everything that we did. It informed how we structured the peer review tools and the student learning experience evaluation. And then the combination of the definition and those evaluation tools, those are what helped us think about, okay, what are the processes that are reasonable? So if we have this classroom observation tool, let's look at how much time it would take for someone to do this work, to be trained in it, to do the evaluation. How reasonable is it for one faculty member to evaluate X number of faculty members a year? And so that drove kind of some of the recommendations we made about peer review evaluation processes. And then we took the definition, the tools, and the processes that we developed, and again, used those to inform what we needed to do to support faculty in reaching the criteria that they would be evaluated on using those tools and processes. And then all of those elements were used to inform the reward structures. So we were rewarding teaching not just on performance, but we wanted our university community to reward investment in teaching. We wanted them to reward effort towards peer evaluation, and we wanted them to reward teaching leadership within each school. So as we're developing all of these resources, our intent was to make, again, this difficult change as manageable as possible. And so the resources we created, we posted them and made them downloadable and editable so that the schools could adopt them wholesale if they wanted to. That would make their teaching plan development very easy. They could edit them, adapt them to their discipline-specific pedagogical practices. And that would kind of help smooth this process a little bit for the schools. One caveat to keep in mind is that for the faculty that had not been sort of part of these conversations, the resources that came out were interpreted as mandates, as resources that had to be used, and that the Center for Excellence in Teaching was now creating policies or forcing schools to use certain resources. And so we had to correct that perception. So again, that's why communication around why you're creating these resources and what they are, intended for, and that schools will continue to have a choice in how they, create their own resources is a really important message to get out. So schools were free to ignore our resources and create their own or find their own in their own sort of discipline-specific pedagogical literature. The only guidance that was given centrally to the schools was their definition of excellence in teaching had to be at least broadly aligned with the university. So for instance, they couldn't leave out something like inclusive practices. Like there had to be some general alignment. And then the evaluation tools and development opportunities and their incentive structures had to be directly tied to the criteria in their definition. And their definition, the criteria in the definition had to be evidence-based. So it had to be sort of a research-led document. Okay. So the first thing we tackled after the definition was revising our questionnaire for student evaluations of teaching. Okay. And the first thing we did there is we changed the title of what used to be our student course evaluations. We changed that to student learning experience evaluation. And the intent behind that was to change the way the campus thought about student input. So we wanted to move away from students being treated as pedagogical experts who were qualified to evaluate instruction and course design, and rather instead ask them about their own learning experience, which they are uniquely qualified to tell us about. And that information is critical to helping us improve our teaching. We need to know how students are experiencing our instruction. But we saw that more as a measure of student engagement and less of a measure of teaching effectiveness. Okay, so then the next thing we did is we created these 5 subscales. And we created the subscales as a result of these recommendations that I told you about earlier from those reports, because faculty wanted help in categorizing the feedback they were getting, you know, like, how do I organize this so that I can make meaningful change in my class? And so the 5 subscales were course design, instructional practices, inclusive practices, assessment practices, and then course impact. Okay. And then within those subscales, we only selected or created items that students were qualified to answer. So we were careful not to ask students to rate a behavior that they weren't trained or qualified to evaluate, right? And then I can provide, if you're interested, I can provide the items that we came up with for our final learning experience evaluation. If you're curious about what those are, I'm happy to share those with you. So then we added items asking students to evaluate their own effort in the class. And this was intended to help to sort of prep students as they're providing feedback about their faculty, to help them understand that their learning is a shared responsibility, right? It depends on their effort, the class's effort, and it depends obviously on their instructor's effort, but they're not passive receptacles that their faculty just pour knowledge into, right? They have to actively seek it and struggle with it, take ownership over it. And so we asked them about behaviors that reflected their own effort in the class to help frame their feedback. And then we also revised the items that asked for qualitative feedback. We removed the omnibus questions, the overall, how would you rate your professor? How would you rate the course? Because these items ask for more of a subjective sense of a student's experience in the class, and it's not tied to any kind of criteria. And so those items are the most subject to bias. So what we did instead is we included items that were tied to criteria that we already asked about. So we said, if you rated one of the above items in these 5 subscales, if you rated those with a lower score, what's one thing the faculty member could do to improve your experience of that one item? So we tied it to the criteria. And then we also asked about what the most valuable part of the course was to their learning process and what the least valuable part of the course was to their learning process. And then finally, we provided guidance on what is and is not appropriate to help students frame their feedback more professionally. So we talked about, you know, personal comments about faculty's appearance or what have you is not appropriate. You should focus your feedback on the course design and the instruction that you received from your faculty. So we didn't expect this to fix everything with the learning experience evaluations. We still knew there would be bias. We still knew they were flawed, but we were trying to minimize some of the problematic aspects while maximizing the value really that the student feedback really does have in helping us improve our teaching. So while we were doing this work, it just so happened that more and more of the research on the problems around student evaluations was being highlighted in some of the higher education media. And USC also had a diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative happening at the same time. And the provost at the time, seeing all of this research, called a meeting and said, you know what, we can't do this. We can't claim to value diversity, equity, and inclusion and still put a large proportion of our faculty at risk by using biased and invalid measures of teaching effectiveness. And so he really made the call to no longer use student evaluations as a primary measure of teaching effectiveness, but it could be used as a measure of student engagement. But teaching effectiveness, the primary measure for that would be peer review. And that was, again, it was an important step that needed to be made by one of the leaders at the school in order for this to be taken seriously across the entire university. But I will be honest, he took some heat for it, you know, because the change was pretty tremendous, and people sort of learned how to work within the system that was the student evaluation system. They learned how to get good evaluations and so forth. And so this really did disrupt a lot of faculty's experience around teaching and around evaluation. So in making the change to our LEEs and how we use them, we were acknowledging what we were actually measuring. So student evaluations are not valid measures of teaching effectiveness. They're actually more akin to satisfaction surveys. Students are not experts. They're not qualified to evaluate pedagogy or instruction, but they are qualified to tell us about their own experience, their own learning experience in class. And that's really critical to our teaching quality. And it should inform our teaching, but it shouldn't be used to determine effectiveness. So after we revised the learning experience evaluation, we moved on to developing peer review tools that were guided by our definition. There were 4 tools that we created, and we created these for both on-ground courses and online versions of the course. The tools were a self-reflection and goal setting document, a rubric, or really it's more of a checklist for syllabus review, for grading and feedback review, and then for classroom observation. And by the way, all of those forms, as I mentioned before, are downloadable and editable. Feel free to take a look at them if they're useful. You can use them. You can change, you know, the branding on them and what have you if they're useful to you. The only thing we ever ask if another university uses them is just that you cite, you know, where you got them somewhere inconspicuously. And then, you know, and you may also use them with your faculty just to give them something to react against so that they can build something that they really buy into. And, you know, maybe we don't like that USC one, but it can serve as a starting place too. So as I mentioned before, schools could choose to adopt these as their own measures. They could edit them or they could create their own. And again, the only guidance was it needs to be tied to their definition, needs to be evidence-based. We also created resources to help schools think about what types of evidence could they use to evaluate teaching effectiveness, teaching development, review of peers' teachings, or teaching inclusive practices and student engagement. And so we sort of created things like, okay, so to evaluate teaching development, you could look at, you know, to what degree a faculty member participated in teaching workshops or training programs, teaching conferences, did they demonstrate leadership in teaching development and so forth. And then after we had a good sense of what our criteria were for excellence in teaching and how we were going to measure it, we then went on to create our faculty development institutes. And we designed those to help faculty achieve the criteria that were in our definition and in our evaluation tools, and to be able to demonstrate that achievement in their instruction and in their course design. And so we really sort of, the definition was threaded throughout everything that we did. And then we tailored those institutes to meet the needs of faculty at 4 points in their career. So we had an institute for future faculty. We had an institute for new faculty. I'm going to skip one. We had an institute for faculty fellows, and those were faculty that deans felt had the capability to lead within the school around the teaching initiative. And so they would send these teacher leaders to the Center for Excellence in Teaching, and we would provide this Faculty Fellows Training Institute, and we would give them a sort of modularized curriculum to take back to their school and customize in any way they saw fit. And that way they would have resources to go back and provide discipline-specific tailored training that use the pedagogical practices within their discipline to their mid-career colleagues in the school. And that was the mid-career school-based institute that we created. And then finally, we worked with schools to reimagine their incentive structures. We encouraged them to use a teaching portfolio model to think about incentive structures where all teaching related activities counted for teaching effort. It didn't get dumped into service. And where faculty would be rewarded for all of these activities in their merit, promotion, or tenure processes. So you'll notice that 50% of the teaching portfolio was teaching effectiveness. And the primary method, again, for evaluating teaching effectiveness is peer review. But some combination of teaching development, reviewing peers, inclusive practices, teaching leadership, those should also be rewarded and be reflected in the merit, tenure, and promotion criteria in each of the schools. And then student engagement should also be assessed, and our LEEs could be used for that as one measure. So we set it as one measure because, again, we know that LEEs tend to be biased. And so to try to help offset that bias, we asked schools to use other measures of student engagement as well. Okay. So then at SC, the intent for counting those activities as teaching was to demonstrate that investing in your teaching, ensuring excellence in your school or your department by reviewing your peers' work, and leading teaching initiatives, those were all highly valued activities at USC, and they should be meaningfully rewarded. So putting those activities in service would have sent the message that we're simply sort of adding on rather than reprioritizing our efforts. And so this is a lot of work. And so we wanted faculty to get the most credit for it as possible, which is why we encourage schools to put it in the teaching bucket rather than in the service bucket. So coming back to the implementation of the model, once the university structures were in place, we focused on school level tasks. So we asked each school to create its own discipline specific plan. And the plan would use a faculty-led shared governance process. So this was really critical. So in the plan template, we actually asked the question, who was involved in creating the plan? Who was on your faculty task force? We sent every message possible that this should not be written by one person in the dean's office, right? It should be a faculty-led process. The faculty council should be involved. It should be discussed at faculty meetings and so forth. And they would use the same model. So every school would need to create a discipline-specific definition of excellence in teaching to guide their plan. And that definition would include the pedagogical practices that are appropriate for your discipline. So dance would have a very different definition than engineering would. They would share some elements, but there would be differences as well. They would need to create opportunities to help faculty reach those criteria in the definition through teaching development. They would need to create a rigorous peer review process that evaluates the criteria in the school's definition. And they would need to revise their incentive structures to reflect the new opportunities around development and also the activities that are needed for evaluating teaching and teaching leaderships and so forth. And those would need to be meaningfully rewarded in the revised incentive structure. And again, schools could use the centralized resources that we created. They could adapt them, or they could develop their own. So again, just to remind you that really the only guidance that went to schools around this was that their Definition needed to be generally aligned with universities. And it needed to be grounded in evidence-based practices. So then we asked the schools, the reason, well, let me back up a little bit. The reason we did this, the reason we didn't do a one-size-fits-all model is A, everyone would revolt at USC because we're so decentralized. But B, we really wanted to ensure that every teaching plan was really customized to the discipline within the school. And we wanted faculty to have ownership and buy-in into this teaching change. We wanted them to feel like they were in control of the process as it changed. And they were. So the university plan provides the framework, right? But the school plans are really where all the action is going to happen. So as of today, in terms of our progress, almost every school, I think we have 20 out of 21 of our academic units have submitted a teaching plan. Many of them were incredibly innovative and comprehensive approaches to our model, but we did have some plans that kind of phoned it in. They met minimum standards and, you know, did what they needed to do to create the plan, and that's fine for now. You know, we sort of see this as a very long game, and we see, you know, as more and more change happens, that's going to sort of motivate more and more change, and, you know, things will get better over time. Peer review has begun in a majority of schools, but it's not fully implemented yet. Merit, promotion, and tenure teaching criteria have changed in most schools, and teaching development opportunities have been implemented in most schools and university-wide. Okay. Oh, I forgot to click that. So anyway, that's what I was talking about, was the school piece. Okay. So to continue on, so finally for this is the part where we're going to talk about faculty. So for the initiative to take hold, a lot is required of faculty. And this is where that values clarification process is really needed at the university in order for this to take hold. So as much as faculty care about their students, as much as they want to do their best for them, the truth is faculty have limited time. They have to allocate that time strategically and wisely. And if they don't see real tangible changes made by the university in the way that it invests in, evaluates, and rewards teaching, any change is going to die on the vine. So throughout our initiative, we have really sort of emphasized the need for visible, tangible changes. And we've been very fortunate that our leadership has sort of supported those kinds of changes, not just our administration, but also our faculty leadership. Throughout the initiative, we asked our faculty to engage in creating their school's teaching plan and their vision. And an incredible number of faculty have engaged in that. And it's really inspired a tremendous amount of conversation around teaching, even before the pandemic, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Our university was talking about teaching more than it, I think, ever has, which was really exciting. We've asked them to reflect on their own teaching and think about areas that they'd like to strengthen. We've asked them to find time in their already packed schedules for developing and evaluating teaching. And this means reprioritizing their efforts. And again, this doesn't happen if they don't see reprioritization at the university level as well. We asked them to invest in development and training activities, to be trained on peer review tools, and to review their colleagues in the same way they do for scholarship. We've asked them to allow their own teaching to be reviewed by their peers. And we've asked many to become teacher leaders in their schools and departments and to support their school's initiative. So that's a lot to ask of faculty. So how are we doing on the faculty level? Well, on the investment in teaching side, we were actually making some great strides. Faculty were coming to institutes, they were engaging with the Center for Excellence in Teaching. Our numbers were up, and then a catastrophe created an exponential shift. So the pandemic has been absolutely horrendous and taken such a huge toll. But the shift to remote teaching has catapulted USC's teaching initiative forward at least 10 years in terms of the number of faculty who have been trained, the number of courses that have been revised and re-examined. It's really been sort of a tectonic shift at all campuses, I know. So the faculty have been able to reflect on their teaching using a different lens. They've reprioritized and reorganized their content. We've had over 1,000 faculty actively engage in 6-week online teaching institutes, like week after week after week, which is 15 times what we would normally see in any year. We've had 3,700 faculty attend 160 workshops. That's 25 times our normal numbers. Faculty have developed communities of practice that on their own, communities of practice in their departments, in their schools, to share best practices and good ideas. We've had reluctant faculty come in for training on the tech, right? They would have never stepped foot into CET had they not had to teach online. But because we were able to kind of answer the one pressing question that really mattered to them, we've had a number of them come back and ask more questions about their teaching. So it's been a way to introduce ourselves to faculty that maybe didn't believe in what we were doing before. We've had senior faculty who, again, would not have come to the center seek training. And many of the faculty have shared, not all, obviously, but many of them have shared, and I'm sure this is true on your campus as well, that they actually feel like they're teaching better now than they have before because they've reorganized their content. They've rethought about the sequencing of things. They've gotten training to help them overcome some of the bottlenecks they had. And many of them talk about wanting to continue to use the tools that they used online once they return to their on-ground courses. So across our campus, faculty are thinking about, talking about, putting a tremendous amount of effort into their teaching. In terms of peer review, we're still in the early stages, but let's talk a little bit about peer review. So the truth is, any effort beyond no effort, which was what was required to look at student evaluation means, is going to be more work. And looking at student evaluation means is all we did at USC before. So this was a big shift for our faculty. But taking the time to review teaching is important in the same way that taking the time to review scholarship is important, right? It helps us to be better. It helps us to reach excellence. And so we really had to have conversations about what our values were and where our students rank in our priorities. So the truth is, peer review is hard. There's no way to get around that. It is hard. It is more work than using student evaluations. But here's the good news. Teaching plans have recently been submitted and approved, and the shift to peer review is just now happening. And in some cases, it's been delayed because of COVID. But what we're hearing for those that are using peer review is that many faculty in the schools who have implemented it say the evaluation of their teaching is more useful now than it has ever been. They're actually getting meaningful feedback that they can use to improve their teaching in the same way the feedback they get when they get an article back, whether it's accepted or rejected. The feedback they get makes them a better scholar. This is making them a better teacher. And they're reporting too that they're learning a great deal from reviewing their peers. So that's not wasted time for them either. They're actually learning from each other by watching each other or looking at each other's documents. So peer review is absolutely hard, but it's doable, it's manageable, and it appears, at least in the early stages, to be worth it. Our reward structures are shifting. So we're beginning to see faculty rewarded for their teaching efforts. So teaching leaders are now being brought into dean's senior leadership teams and leading schools' teaching efforts. We have a new continuing appointment option that's been created that provides the university's best teachers with essentially what amounts to tenure for teaching. And our first candidate's actually being reviewed right now as we speak, which is really exciting. Activities, excuse me, activities like teaching development and reviewing peers is showing up in merit and promotion and tenure criteria. And as a result, faculty are beginning to submit much richer and sort of more varied evidence of teaching excellence, which is really exciting to see. So that's all I have for you. If there are questions, I'm happy to take them. And I'll go ahead and take this down, stop share.
Ginger, there are some comments in the chat that might be interesting. I noticed that Dr. Stewart just weighed in and said retention and advancement of non-tenure track is absolutely essential.
Yes, so all of our non-tenure track, we actually call them RTPC, and it's a very clunky name, but it's the best we could come up with after 10 years of arguing about it. It's research track, teaching track, practitioner track, and clinical track faculty. So we don't call them non-tenure track anymore. We call them by what they are rather than what they aren't. So all schools are required to have promotion tracks for full-time RTPC faculty, as well as part-time faculty and adjunct faculty. And they also have to have merit processes for them as well. And they have to be, those processes have to be approved through the provost office. So we believe our, in particular, our teaching track faculty with regard to teaching really help hold up the university. And so we want them to feel valued and to see their worth at the university. Let's see. The student learning experience. Right, so our student learning experience evaluation, we're sort of separating that from other measures of teaching effectiveness. We're really looking at peer review as our measures of teaching effectiveness, because the research has demonstrated that SET, student evaluation of teaching, aren't correlated with other measures of teaching effectiveness, and they're not correlated with learning outcomes. And so we sort of pulled that out of teaching effectiveness and created more of a category of student engagement as a part of the teaching portfolio. And then let's see. Trying to see if there are other. I'm not seeing other comments. Are there other questions? Have students responded to the change? That's a very good question. The students, again, I think one of our failures was a lack of engagement of the students on this process and a lack of communication about the process. The student governments were in the midst of trying to create some resolutions to address some of the teaching issues. In fact, they wanted the student evaluations to be made public so that they could make better choices about their courses. And so we've met with the student government organizations and shared with them what's happening, and shared with them the documents and the templates that we're using, and showed them some of the evaluation tools that we've created and so forth. And they're very excited to see that, but they're skeptical, because they're still, in classes with some faculty who are amazing and fantastic, and other faculty who they're not really connecting with. And so it's sort of a we'll believe it when we see it kind of scenario. But I think they're skeptically hopeful.
Well, Ginger, I was taking notes like crazy the whole time that you talked, and I suspect that others were as well, based on the rigor of the chat. And so I want to We have two final questions in the chat
Yeah.
that we'll let you tackle. I do want to point out to our audience that we have saved the chat. We are going to be putting together these resources and making these available. We'll be sharing your materials and Emily's materials as well, and then all of the great things that have been shared here in the chat. So maybe you could just tackle those last two questions as we wrap up our time.
And I'll share my slides, and my slides actually have the notes that I use. It's a little bit of a script, so it's going to seem hokey to you, but the notes do have a lot of details and content in them. So hopefully that would be useful as well. So I'll share all of that with you. Let's see, efforts. So what efforts were made to equip faculty to evaluate their peers? We provided training through the Center for Excellence in Teaching, because we also were trying to minimize bias in peer review and make sure that it was sort of, we had inter-rater reliability, and that people were able to, evaluate each other in a valid way, so that they could recognize the behaviors that were in the tools we were using and so forth. So we do provide training on that. The increase in emphasis in teaching, did it affect the research productivity of some of the research-focused faculty? How to encourage faculty to be excellent at both. One of the things that we talked about at USC was sort of scaffolding this a bit, so that particularly for junior or for tenure track faculty, for junior level faculty, who are maybe going up for tenure, what we would be looking for was a significant investment in their teaching, but we wouldn't necessarily be looking for excellence in their teaching just yet. But to be promoted from associate to full, we would have expected more sort of growth in their teaching performance, and we would have looked for excellence at that level. And so we recognize that people can't be excellent at everything all at once, and that it does take time to build this. But the hope is, over time, as we bring in junior faculty and sort of they grow into the university, we will be providing development opportunities all along the way, so it will become just a part of what they do. And we're very careful about how much time we're requiring for this, and helping faculty kind of learn how to manage their time appropriately. So we haven't seen research productivity go down as yet, but it's still very early in the stages. So I may need to update you on that later on. And then let's see, the last question. Oh, I think those were the two last questions.
Emily, would you like to make a comment?
Just wanted to say to that, within AAU institutions where we've seen the shift to evidence-based pedagogy, which then would be what would be evaluated in this system, we've seen research productivity go up on the campuses of the faculty members who have put work time in this space. And the other piece that we've seen happen on some AAU campuses and in the hiring of new research active faculty is a part of their startup packages are some funds dedicated towards the teaching. So it signals to them from the start that they have some resources available to them to help support them in their startup of teaching, that they then can partner often with teaching and learning centers or with their disciplinary society around professional development. And that has been something that has signaled, in addition to the funds for the research in the lab, it is also something that they're getting as part of their package, which a department can facilitate.
Wow, that's a great idea. Well, my goodness, thank you both so much. What a rich conversation this has been. A virtual clap from all of us. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. We truly appreciate it. To my Texas Tech colleagues here, in looking ahead, we're going to take a break here and